Welcome to the latest episode of Gryphon Manor. Now, in the last episode, I ventured to the wild and distant land of Andover, where I spent a lot of time building an actual coaching inn, which would serve as the hub of the new and improved village. And then I went out to tear down the remnants of the old village, only to find that I'd somehow misplaced the original population of Andover, and that I was essentially left with just a ghost town. I then spent a considerable amount of time and effort populating the inn and relearning the joys of Minecraft villager management, and ultimately discovering that much of my frustration was due to the mods that I was using, or not using and then using, which is to say it was pretty much my own fault. Though, let's face it, villager management is no picnic on the best of days. However, that was then, and this is now. And this time around, I got all my confusion and ad-libbing done ahead of time and off camera. What I'm babbling about is that in a normal rotation, this episode would be returned to the manor, and it is. In fact, what I had planned to do was to build out the module in the workshop where all the manual workstations would be, and in vanilla Minecraft, that's basically a crafting table, an anvil, a smithing table, a grindstone, and a cartography table. And I could blow through the whole shebang in less than a minute. But this is modded Minecraft, and I've more manual workstations than that just from the chip mod alone. So I figured that I would briefly introduce and describe all the manual workstations from the mods, and then try to logically lay them out, and that would be that. But that would still only get me about 10 minutes, and so I figured that I would round out the episode by spending some time to analyze the map and the data that I gathered during my expansion of the known world back in episode 9. And as I've been working through all of that, I began to have ideas, and of course one idea led to another, and another, and even as I write this, I realize I've only begun to scratch the surface in terms of ideas for projects and systems, and new ones will still come to me each day, usually while I'm in the shower, because that's where I've historically done my best thinking. Seriously. Anyway, I could do an entire video series just on the brainstorming and planning, but I won't subject you to that. Or at least not just that. So I flipped this episode around, and I will talk about my plans for my own new little world order. And at the end of the episode, I will set up the manual bits of the workshop, and then we can call it a night and head off to the Rose and Crown for a pint. That is, of course, if you don't mind all the villagers incessantly opening and shutting the damn door. Before I start talking about all the crazy ideas I have, it'll be necessary to set some boundaries. Literally. As of episode 9, the known world in this series is a square bit of land that is 10 kilometers to a side, which works out to 100 square kilometers. And that sounds like a lot of space, and trust me, if it was a big lawn and you had to mow it with a push mower, you would definitely agree with me. However, in that 100 square kilometers, I have uncovered an active volcano, jungles, plains, forests, beaches, and oceans. Well, lakes really, but I'm getting ahead of myself. As I stand on a tall hill and scan the far and distant horizon, I see a large and beautiful world all around me. But while it's certainly beautiful, it really isn't all that large, is it? So consider this. If I dig as deep as I can possibly dig here in a modern Minecraft world, I can reach down a little over 120 meters from sea level. And you just can't dig any deeper than that in a survival world, and obviously that's even deeper than the deepest ocean in Minecraft, which incidentally is about 30 meters deep. So if the Titanic had sunk in these waters, it would be resting on the ocean bottom while the top 2 meters would be sticking out at the surface. And the purpose for saying all this is to point out that Mojang has really done something remarkable, and that is they've given us an illusion of a vast world when in fact it's not nearly as vast as it seems. And yes, the total surface area of an infinite Minecraft world is a little over 18 times larger than the actual Earth, but that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, in the real world, if the atmospheric conditions are just right, on a clear day, you can see out over 150 kilometers. But in my little 10 by 10 kilometer world, I have my render distance maxed out at 32 chunks, and that means that on a crystal clear day, I can see half a kilometer out. And unless some jerk comes by and explains all of this to you and breaks the illusion, like I am now, this works for us. In fact, it's great. This little illusionary technique has a name. It's called forced perspective, and they use it in game level design all the time. But some of the absolute masters of this art are the Imagineers at Disney, who've employed it throughout their theme parks, so that as you walk through the park surrounded by ice-covered mountains and medieval castles and fantastic tree houses that tower above you, they are in fact not nearly as tall as it sometimes seems. And speaking of Disney, here's a little coincidence. Disney World in Orlando, Florida, originally covered just over 100 square kilometers, which is almost exactly the same size as the known world I've explored here. And that's really what I wanted to establish with all this babbling, that basically I have a plot of land the size of Disney World with which to work, and so all the stuff I've been thinking about needs to fit into that little box with a little forced perspective of my own. And almost since the beginning of this series, I've talked about dividing this world up into regions, each of which would be roughly based on some historical culture and/or era. I even went so far as to designate a region smack dab in the middle of the map, and I named it Gryphonshire. And as you might expect with a name like that, it is destined to be a place filled with a whole lot of tea-drinking, biscuit-eating, tweed-wearing goodness based on the United Kingdom, particularly England, and approximately during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, which is prime material for a steampunkish world. But that is clearly not the whole world, and as I've opened up parts of the map, I have commented on what kinds of regions I might have put here and there, and well, today's the day. I am planting flags, and at this point I've only settled on the cultures and the architecture I want to capture and represent, but I have not gone as far with any of these other regions as I have with Gryphonshire, which is to say that I have not come up with a name for any of them. I have not planned out roads or fully inventoried the existing villages or planned for additional villages or anything like that yet. But I have taken a big step in that direction, and you'll understand more as I start talking about settlements, transportation systems, and all that jazz. To the west, I have the to-be-named region based on the Hawaiian Islands, and just a note here, you may have noticed that I'm not using the official state flag Hawaii to represent this area. Instead, I'm using the, and I hope to God I'm saying this right, Kanaka Maolai, which some believe was the flag used before full colonization. Now, I personally doubt that. I suspect it is a modern invention, but since it has started circulating, it has definitely started to become a symbol of an independent and pre-colonial Hawaii, so I use it here in that sense. Considering that this is a steampunk-ish world based on technology and traditional Hawaiian culture, is a historically Stone Age sedentary hunter-gatherer culture with a healthy dose of agriculture thrown in, I need to do a whole lot of Imagineering here. And I will extend traditional Hawaiian forms with the architecture of the colonial era and reimagine the whole mix as a what if the Hawaiians retain sovereignty and join the modern world. And by modern, I mean in the steampunkish sense. So I will try to pay due respect to the culture and traditions of the Hawaiian people, and if I offend anyone, please accept my apologies ahead of time, and don't be shy, let me know about it. I can't fix what I don't know. South of the Hawaiian region is my Chinese region, which is represented here by the flag of the Qing dynasty, which was in power during my target time period, roughly 1880 to 1915. And obviously, Chinese culture and architecture is pretty distinct from Western architecture, so I can see a lot of great opportunity here. And just as I plan to do with the Hawaiians, I will mesh the historical bits into the steampunkish bits. And China at this time was going through its own industrial revolution, so there'll be plenty of mixing and matching between the traditional and the steampunkish modern. Southeast of my unnamed Chinese region is my unnamed Japanese region, and for many Westerners, it is sometimes difficult to differentiate between the cultures of Southeast Asia. So I hope to do justice to those distinctions as I integrate them into my world and the steampunk genre. I have long been a fan of Kira Kurosawa's work, and so I have all sorts of ideas about the traditional side of Japanese architecture and life. But with the explosion of anime over the years, I also have a lot of great material from which to draw more modern inspiration, and I'm pretty excited about that. East of the Japanese region is a land I've reserved for my as yet unnamed Korean region. And again, I'm using a historical flag to represent this space. This time it's the flag of the Korean Empire, which existed from 1897 to 1910, and during which much of Korean life, industry, and the economy was being modernized for the time. So this will also mesh well with a steampunkish world. To the north of my little piece of Korea is a jump to the other end of Eurasia with my as yet unnamed Norwegian space. Now, all the cold biomes really put the pressure on me to pick a culture that was as comfortable with snow and ice as they are without them, and that's how I ended up in Norway. Now, as I mentioned in a previous episode, the fictional country of Arendelle was a setting of Disney's Frozen, and that was pretty heavily based on 19th century Norway. So you can use that as the benchmark for what I'm shooting for here, and of course it will be given the full steampunkish makeover. North of my wannabe Arendelle is my wannabe Germany. And again, I fell back to a historical flag, as the Germany of my targeted time period is the German Empire, which existed from 1871 until its defeat at the end of World War I in 1918. I am looking forward to mixing quaint Germanic medieval buildings and streets with modern steam trains and airships. This is the kind of setting that just screams for steampunkish treatment. And of course, if I'm going to have the English and the Germans, then how could I possibly proceed without the French? And this time period is an interesting one in historical France, as it saw the climax of the Beaux Arts movement and the creation of the Eiffel Tower. And I have no idea whether I will attempt to recreate that most French of all landmarks, but at this point, it's definitely on the table. Northwest of my French and German regions, we run into much warmer biomes, and so I go someplace completely different. This will be my steampunkish integration of the Aztec Empire, if we were to assume that it survived the colonial era intact. And just as I plan to do with my Hawaiian region, I want to take the historical Aztec culture and extrapolate it out to this era and integrate it into the Victorian era and that look and feel, while still maintaining and respecting Aztec traditions and aesthetics. Moving northwest, I jump continents again with a return to Southeast Asia, specifically Thailand, though at this time it was the Kingdom of Siam, as represented here by the vintage flag of the period. Now, traditional Thai culture is very distinct from the other Asian cultures I've included here, and so I have even more to learn about that than I do of the others, if such a thing's possible. So I'm looking forward to delving into all of that. Moving westward, I return to Europe for the remaining three regions, and the first is the unnamed region based on the Netherlands. Now, in this case, there are lots of wetlands, marshes, and outright swamps, and I plan on reclaiming the land just as the Dutch have been doing for centuries. They have their own distinctive architecture, and like the other European traditions, they will mesh quite easily into the vibe and theme I'm looking for here. Continuing westward, we come to the region based on the Kingdom of Italy, and I'm a little torn here. At the moment, the plan is to base this area off the Kingdom of Italy at the close of the 19th century, so that would be an Italy that is modern for the time period, but with lots of ruins and integrations with what remains of the Roman Republic and Empire. However, I could take a cue from my integrations with the Hawaiian and Aztec regions and turn back the clock and consider what if the Roman Empire survived to the end of the 19th century and then integrated into a steampunkish technology base. And in a similar vein, I have the region to the south based on Greece. Again, the current plan is to integrate the Greece of the time with plenty of ruins and other vestiges of her glorious past. However, I might also retool that to bring classical Greece through all the centuries and integrate a modern version of classical Greece into the technological flavor of this world. In looking back at the mix I just talked about, there is a heavy emphasis on Eurasia, and that is mostly because I have a limited number of warm weather biomes and almost zero desert and savanna out there. Also, when I was considering historical nations to include, the few warm biomes I have are best fit for West Africa, but that was the center of the colonial slave trade, so my natural instinct was to steer clear. However, the irony is I have chosen plenty of European nations that started, encouraged, and facilitated the slave trade. So, yeah, every region on this map has some dark splotches on their national character, and so in all cases, I will downplay or ignore the negative and accentuate the positive. And in future expansions, the emphasis will be to move away from Eurasia. And once again, I'm not out to disrespect anybody's ancestry or traditions, and I'm very open to advice from those who know more than me. And for most of these cultures, that's pretty much anyone. So please feel free to speak up in the comments with your suggestions, ideas, and opinions. Just please keep it civil and polite. Anyway, I now have a lot of planning and work in my future, but it really does sound fun and challenging. And of course, there's no rush to come up with designs or transportation planning right away. As you may have noticed, that this series is taking its sweet old time as I work through the existing plans for Gryphonshire, so it might be quite a bit longer before I really need to decide a direction for all these more distant bits. One more thing to mention is that I've been monkeying around with the length of the Minecraft day, courtesy of the Hourglass mod. Now, I originally set the full day-night cycle to 24 hours to perfectly match the real world. And yeah, that turned out to be way too long for my taste. So I'm currently running it at 2 hours for a full day-night cycle. That's 1 hour of daylight and 1 hour of night. And I think that's a pretty good compromise. At least it works for me. However, I do have a problem in that with the Hourglass mod running, the stupid phantoms are out every single freaking night. So I'm looking for and evaluating my options in that regard. I don't want to get rid of the phantoms, but I would like to take a moonlight stroll every once in a while without being constantly bombarded from the air. If you've been watching this series, by now you've started to see the look and feel of this world begin to take shape. However, what you've seen so far is still pretty limited compared to what I have locked up in my head. And that is because it is hard to incorporate a world of advanced clockwork and steam into what is, or has been, essentially a quiet rural space. And it's kind of like trying to mechanize a hobbit hole. You can do it, but what you have at the end of the process is probably about as un-hobbit-like as you can possibly get. So I need to work in some different settings that are more conducive to the whole steampunkish motif. In other words, I need cities, or at least fantastical circumstances for smaller settlements, especially when you consider my remarks at the beginning of this episode, that I'm currently playing in a sandbox the size of Disney World. If you compare it to historical London, my entire map is just a few neighborhoods. And if you compare it to modern Greater London, it's not really much more than a large car park. And so I need to be a little creative here and play around with some sort of forced perspective that I talked about. For one thing, my expanded world map was created with the second and much larger mod mix, and that mix included a lot of mods that impacted village design and placement, which includes the addition of sky villages. And as I mentioned in episode 9, the novelty of those villages wore off after about the third one. But they are fantastic seeds from which to build something entirely new. Likewise, there are a number of large alien airships fixed in the sky, and I can use the sky villages and the ships from which to build new flying villages, towns, and even cities. They might not need to be flying either. Some can be built on great pillars or something similar to that, and all of these options would be fantastic integration points for steampunk technology. In fact, aside from some major magical influence, it would be the only way I could feasibly explain that kind of thing. But the original Gryphonshire was generated before the big wave of mod editions, and so there are no sky villages, but there are a few tiny flying islands left over from my flirtation with the Langley transport mod. Now, I might do something with those, but what I'm really committed to is to build a proper steampunkish city in the big open wilderness on the south coast of Gryphonshire. When I was originally drawing the borders of this region, this area seemed to be naturally empty of generated villages, and while I planned out completely new villages in other parts of Gryphonshire, I left this one empty with the notion that I wanted a bit of wilderness nearby. But how wild can the wilderness really be if you can't get any further than a single kilometer from a pub or an inn? So I'm ditching the idea of wilderness, and this is where I want to build my proper city. However, a city, even by Minecraft's smaller and gentler scale, is still pretty big. And so how do I add all this urban complexity in my little patch of ground? Well, the answer is not to build outward, but to build upward, and maybe to a lesser extent downward. Basically, I envision a city that's not built as a single layer over the existing surface of the land, but rather a city that's built upward in multiple layers from the existing and older structures at the surface of the land. Now, I've not figured out how high I will go with this, but I have decided to stick with my modular design system. So instead of using only the 11 by 11 by 9 modules that I use in my base, I will use a mix of those modules and new larger 21 by 21 by 27 modules, which are 4 times larger horizontally and 3 times higher vertically. The larger scale is what I plan to use in the more open public spaces, and that particular size lets me cleanly integrate it with the smaller scale for interior spaces. For example, the core of the city will be based on this island near the center bottom of this open space. I do plan to leave this as an island, but the city will extend to the other side of the water to the west, north, and east. That open space will be covered with vaulted ceilings and columns at the larger scale, and the shores will be stone quays and wharves and with all the normal traditional Victorian waterfront features, including some of the less savory bits of town. And interesting real-world historical tidbit is that before the invention of elevators or lifts, the very tallest buildings would typically reach up no higher than 4 or 5 floors, and the most desirable and therefore most expensive housing was on the ground floor. That's because the only way to get to the top was to use the stairs, and in an era where there is no indoor plumbing, no running water, and no elevator, living on the top floor was a major pain in the butt. You had to haul up your water and run downstairs and probably outside to use the privy. Once indoor plumbing and elevators arrived, that literally flipped, and the most expensive and desirable accommodations were now on the top floors, and that's when the idea of the penthouse was born. Therefore, I figured that the poorest and dirtiest parts of the city will be the lowest and innermost bits where there's less access to natural light and fresh air. And as one goes upward or outward, the character of the city changes and becomes more upscale and refined. So with the best and most desirable bits at the surface of the city. Now, the city would essentially be my wannabe London, but I won't call it London. Instead, I chose the name of Sudchester, which basically would have meant that the site was once the home of a military fort, Chester, in the south. Sudchester. However, thinking up this design and actually implementing it are 2 different things with a whole lot of planning in between. But now that I've said it here, I'm committed. So keep tuning in to see where it goes from here. Now that I'm starting to plan all the great places to go in this little world, the question remains as to how to actually get to them. And when this world started, my plans and mods basically allowed for travel by foot, horse, wagon, trains, and some small ships and aircraft. Now my plans and options have been expanded a bit, but before I get to that, let me take a moment to go back and think about transportation in the context of my limited world size. This world is a square that is 10 kilometers to a side, and for those of you in the United States, that's 6.2 miles to a side. A healthy runner with a straight and paved track across the whole thing could probably run from one side to the other in about 40 minutes. And for the purposes of full transparency, I could probably cover the same ground in just under 3 days, not counting the time I spent in the emergency room. But really, If you could run from one side of the world to the other in 40 minutes, why would anyone bother with the hassle and expense of ships or trains or especially of aircraft? I mean, by the time you got into the air from takeoff, it'd be time to line up and land. The truth is that they probably wouldn't, and even with the smaller and gentler scale of Minecraft worlds, 100 square kilometers is probably the absolute minimum size where the inclusion of these kinds of transportation modes doesn't start to feel too forced. Like the Disneyland Railroad, which makes a complete circuit of the park in about 20 minutes, including stops. So let's talk a bit about the transportation infrastructure and how I plan to implement and use it. Walking and riding horses are pretty self-explanatory. However, both of these activities have become outright hazardous after the Caves and Cliffs updates. I mean, Minecraft has always had a disproportionate number of caves and openings to the underground, but after those updates, the overworld has become one massive falling hazard, and the days of just jumping on a horse and riding as fast as possible across open plains without the need for much caution, they're long gone. Now you have to ride with an eye to the ground, or you will almost certainly fall into a very deep hole before you complete your first kilometer. And ironically, and perhaps unfortunately, this is one of the few instances where Minecraft respects gravity. Therefore, roads are no longer a nice thing to have or a purely cosmetic addition. They've really become a safety feature, and with a decent road system in place, one can return to running or riding across the land with reckless abandon, as long as they stick to the road. Now, with mods in place, you can add wagons and automobiles to that list as well. Besides, roads are one of the elements that will shape the perceived realism of this place, so there will definitely be plenty of them, and lots of bridges as well. In fact, since most Minecraft worlds are not really made up of continents and oceans, but rather lots of land with plenty of small and medium-sized lakes in between, it will eventually be possible to reach about 90% or more of the land via foot, horse, wagon, or car using the roads. But all of that was probably already a given. So what about the railways? Yes! When I was reintroduced to modded Minecraft over a year ago, I quickly discovered the Create mod and their actual bona fide trains. Now, I had limped along for years with vanilla Minecraft minecart networks, and it always felt like the equivalent of when little kids play, "Hey Johnny, pretend this refrigerator box is a rocket ship." But with the Recreate mod, I can and will have proper trains, and I will modify my usual transportation designs to make full use of them. Traditionally, I've used minecart networks in two different ways. One, as an underground grid to facilitate longer distance travel, and two, with a few surface lines to access high traffic destinations. Now, I've always stuck with the underground networks, but as the years have passed, I placed fewer and fewer networks on the surface because it just looked goofy to have a nice looking train station and then a teeny weeny track running up to it with a small minecart pulling up to the platform. Again, it's kind of like kids playing pretend in an adult world. But the advantages of running lines deep underground have remained constant. For one thing, in vanilla Minecraft, you can't ride a horse across deep water without getting thrown off, and getting your horse across after that is a pain in the butt, even before the Caves and Cliffs update. Using rowboats for anything other than yourself is likewise a pain in the butt, and you can often accidentally kill your passengers for trying to get them out of the damn boat. But the lakes, the oceans, don't extend all the way down to bedrock, so if you build a line just above bedrock, your lines can cross the map without having to deal with open water, though the occasional patch of open magma is a problem. Not only that, digging out those networks produces a constant stream of deep slate, redstone, diamonds, and other buried goodies. Therefore, I would typically build a minecart grid with stations and intersections at 1 kilometer intervals. And I already plan to do exactly the same thing here, but with Create trains. Though now that I have the option to actually make them look like something, I will probably try to make them look and feel like the London Underground of the Edwardian era. And with trains from the Create mod, I plan to return railways to the surface with proper stations and platforms. Now, at this point, I think they'll probably have one large station in Sudchester, something like the original Victoria station in real-life London, and that will serve as the terminus of the various rail lines that will spread out to the rest of the map. Now, the surface trains will probably have a traditional steam-driven look and feel, probably modeled off the locomotives, carriages, and possibly the livery of the Great Western Railway. And that about covers the land. But what about the water? I mean, traditionally, Minecrafters have had the option to swim for it or jump into a rowboat, and that included some of the problems I just mentioned. However, for somebody like me that wants to build expansive landscapes that have at least a passable resemblance to the real thing, having a great waterfront with a bunch of rowboats pulled up is kind of anticlimactic. And yes, I could craft my own static ships in port or on the water, and in fact some of my new mods do exactly that, but I personally don't like it. I want my ships to be actual vehicles that move from point A to point B and not just small ship-like islands. And so that's why I added the small ships mod from the start. They look great, and while they're still kind of small, they look and feel much better for the part they play. And they are actual ships, so you can use them for travel. However, I now have a new water option that I plan to use, probably for water travel between the various regions, and that is trains from the Create mod, sort of. You see, there's an add-on for Create called Steam and Rails, and as a big train nut, I added that about 30 seconds after I added the Create mod. So last summer, those guys added some new features to the mod, including phantom rails and invisible bogies. And with these new features, I could run phantom track, which is normally invisible, through the water and then set up quote-unquote trains on those tracks using invisible bogies. And I could then schedule those same trains to different ports to drop off water traffic in exactly the same way as regular land-based trains would. And if it wasn't clear before now, I would build these water trains look like proper ships. Now, in the local context, I would probably build ships that appear to be completely steam-driven and or a combination of steam and sail power. And this will not only look cool, but bring real life to the waterfront. And I have to admit that this is almost as exciting to me as setting up the land-based trains. And finally, there's travel by air. Now, I'm running immersive aircraft, so I have access to primitive planes, which require a proper landing field, and airships, which don't really require anything, but can be pretty squirrely to control, especially during a thunderstorm. So to support these, I plan to build aerodromes where they logically make sense and where there's available land, as well as airship docks, even in places where a proper landing strip is not feasible. Oh yeah, I forgot. I will also enable air travel via Create Trains. Yes, the same mechanics that allow me to hide tracks in the water and mask trains as proper watercraft will also allow me to hide trains in the sky and mask trains as proper aircraft. So I will almost certainly disguise them as airships of some flavor. And that about covers the analysis and plans for the wider world. Now, I want to return to the focus of the workshop and talk about the manual workstations. Now, up front, I described the manual workstations that come from vanilla Minecraft, and by that list, you should have a good idea what kinds of workstations I'm talking about, and with over 200 mods installed in this world, it should not come as a surprise there are a non-trivial number of modded workstations that I will need to set up here in order to achieve full functionality within those mods. So, except for the immersive engineering mods, I should have everything I need to make these workstations right now. So I will. And I will place them according to the plan I've worked up, where I tried to keep related workstations together, but broke them up into little islands so that I could still get around and move through the area. First and foremost, there needs to be the classic vanilla crafting table, and that is at the heart of this layout. However, I'm also running the Farmer's Delight mod, and the cutting board is an important crafting station within that mod. And while most of us think of the cutting board as an important kitchen tool, it is also an important tool outside of the kitchen, well, at least in the Minecraft context. You can use it to strip the bark off logs, break amethyst blocks into crystals, and recover leather from leather armor, and so much more. So, yeah, there it is. This is a steampunkish world, so firearms are a fact of daily life, and they exist in this world courtesy of Mr. Crayfish and his mod, which requires a special workstation to make and assemble the various bits and pieces into some impressive weaponry. Grindstones and anvils are vanilla classics that go a long ways toward managing experience and enchantments, as well as more mundane repairs. From the Immersive Engineering mod comes the Engineer's Crafting Table, which is essentially a crafting table with built-in storage, and it is also an ingredient for the Engineer's Workbench, which allows the creation and modification of some immersive engineering tools, as well as additional storage. The Engineer's Crafting Table is also an ingredient in the Engineer's Circuit Table, which enables programming of immersive engineering logic circuits. I have set up space for a semi-automated composting rig where items to compost can be dumped into a cabinet from where they will automatically get added to a vanilla composter, and the resulting bone meal will get pulled out of the composter and get deposited into the main storage system. Though I have little use for it, I will also add the vanilla cartography table for working magic with vanilla Minecraft maps, and I will add a smithing table, which is mostly for upgrading diamond armor and gear to netherite, but some mods have added some extra uses as well. Then there's the need for the architect's cutter from the Domnum Ornamentum mod, which I covered in some detail in a recent mod deep dive video, and it enables the modification of all sorts of blocks and doors. And of course there is the very useful vanilla stone cutter, which has also been modified to handle plank blocks through the use of my mod mix. There are a number of workstations that come to me via the chip mod, and all of them take up 2 blocks of space. There is the alchemy bench, which allows me to transform plain vanilla blocks of amethyst, coal, crying obsidian, lapis, diamond, emerald, gold, iron, netherite, lodestone, sponge, glowstone, and copper into a number of decorative versions of the same block. The botanist workbench basically does the same thing for blocks of ice, blue ice, packed ice, snow, dirt, mud, packed mud, clay, gravel, sand, soul sand, tree leaves, frog lights, bone, red and brown mushrooms, spiderwebs, hay, moss, crimson and warped roots, crimson and warped fungus, netherwort, pumpkins, melon, shroom lights, dried kelp, lily pads, nether sprouts, and vines. Not surprisingly, the carpenter's table from the chip mod works in the same way for torches, doors, trapdoors, ladders, bookshelves, barrels, crimson and warped stems, and of course blocks of planks and logs, including most modded versions if you have the right compats loaded. In keeping with the chipped theme, the mason's table transforms blocks of ancient debris, bricks, mud bricks, nether bricks, red nether bricks, raw copper, raw iron, raw gold, terracotta, glazed terracotta, sandstone, concrete, quartz, purpur, prismarine, netherrack, obsidian, magma, dripstone, and of course all the vanilla stone types. The Tinker's Table lets you transform iron bars, sea lanterns, redstone lamps, iron lanterns, soul lanterns, blocks of redstone, and redstone torches. Perhaps my favorite of the chipped workstations is the glass blower, which transforms blocks and panes of glass into fantastic and artistic variations. And the last workstation from the chip mod is the loom table, which lets you change blocks of wool and vanilla carpets into a range of much more interesting options. From the Woodworks mod, we get the sawmill, which essentially acts as a stone cutter, but for wood. And it often allows the creation of wooden crafted items directly from logs without the need to create planks. I will need a schematic table from the Create mod, which allows me to load up the save schematics into an empty schematic page, which in turn then can be used with the schematic cannon to actually fire and build whatever the schematic is of. From the Gallosphere mod comes the combustion table, which allows me to modify any silver bombs I might have made, and by modify I mean customize for specific effects and behaviors. Finally, there's the auto mechanic table, which allows me to craft the vehicle components for the automobility mod. Though actually putting a vehicle together will require the automobile assembler, and I won't want to put that down here though, because it's where you assemble or repair your vehicle, and then you need to drive it off the assembler. And if the assembler's down at the workshop level, I won't be able to fit any of the vehicles into my elevator. And that completes the space for the manual crafting and processing. In most ways, it is probably the least impressive of my accomplishments from this series, but in a few key ways, it is the most important and practical. Next time around, I will set up my smelting stations, and there's a lot more complexity around that than you might initially believe. With all the mods I have, there are a number of specialized smelting options, and I plan to set up a mix of automated and manual smelting stations. Between what I have set up in this episode and what I will set up in that episode, I think I'll be able to handle maybe 60 to 70% of all the possible resource processing. And so the devices that come after this will generally be much more narrow in purpose and scope. And of course, there's the next chapter in the rebirth of the village of Andover, though that will be the episode after this one. In the meanwhile, I hope this finds you and yours in good health, good spirits, and a touch of good fortune. Take care of yourselves out there. Cheers.